On behalf of Jill Lucia, Director of the Library, and the entire staff of Falvey, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's scholarship at Villanova lecture. We're just kicking off our spring 2012 programming, and we're excited to host an extensive lineup of events every semester. This Wednesday, February 8th, we'll host the next installment in the New York Times ongoing College in the First Year video conference series, just next door in room 205. And on Thursday, we'll welcome poet and scholar Daniel Tobin, author of Awake in America, to read from his work in our new Falvey Speakers Corner, which is at the back of the first floor. There are still many more programmings coming up throughout the semester, and you can find info on all of these on our website, which is library.villanova.edu. Today, we are excited to welcome Dr. Bernard Gallagher to present his talk titled Schizophrenia, Groups at Risk and Recently Discovered Causes, which is based on research from his new book, The Sociology of Mental Illness. Dr. Gallagher leads a Villanova research team investigating the causes of schizophrenia, and his team has found data suggesting that some cases of schizophrenia may stem from a prenatal illness, and that influenza vaccination of pregnant women may be an important method of preventing some cases of this mental illness. To present his important research and kick off this semester's Scholarship at Villanova Lecture Series, please welcome me in joining Dr. Gallagher.
I got the applause. I can sit down now. Huh? I'm really grateful to Gina and to Alexandra, and thank you, Pat, for the nice introduction. I'm also grateful to my chairman. I don't see him here yet. He took a few dollars out of the departmental budget so I could rent this suit. I'm really happy. Tom is so gracious. And I also want to thank my co-researchers, one of whom sits here today, Brian Jones, who is an excellent statistician, highly intelligent person, knows it. And Joe McFalls. Yeah, I'll need it, right? And Joe McFalls, who's also in our department, and he specializes in demography. I'll tell you about the people on the team in a moment. At any rate, the reason why the first slide has both the words sociological and medical on it is because we're dealing with a phenomenon that's a psychotic hazard and really of unknown origins. Although research over the last 20 or 30 years has shown that it seems to be the result of environmental stressors combined with a biological predisposition. The evidence that this condition is genetic in origin is pretty impressive, but if you look at the studies of identical twins, where one twin is known to be a schizophrenic, and you count what percentage of time the other twin is also schizophrenic, it's about 50%. And that's impressive, and it clearly makes it likely that many cases stem from genes, but what about the other 50%? They can't be explained by genetic pathways. So I hope today to give you a little bit about what schizophrenia is all about. I don't want to come off like doom and gloom and use words that are extremely negative, because there is a glimmer of hope in terms of uncovering causes and in terms of the causes that we've been looking at, perhaps actually doing something about them. So that's my first slide, and it's pink, because that manifests the feminine side of me. That was my first attempt at humor, and it went over real well. Okay, first, let's take a look at the extent of the problem. In class, I tell my students first week that mental illness is a serious, major social problem in the United States. And I could take out the word serious social problem, I could take out the words mental illness and just replace it with the one word schizophrenia. Because if you do the math, the estimates are that it affects 1 to 2% of the American population. If you take the conservative estimate from the National Institute of Mental Health, the 1%, we currently have a population of 330 million, am I right? I always look at Brian for confirmation. 1% of that is 3,300,000. So we're dealing with a lot of people, and that's the small number. The evidence that we have from other countries and throughout time and history is that this 1% seems to be a cross-cultural constant, so it's nothing peculiar to a particular century or country. Age of onset, curiously enough, is between 18 and 25. I say curiously enough because here we have a person who for 18 years may have been functioning quite well. I don't want to give you the impression that they went to bed normal and ended up waking up psychotic, but functioned quite well until brain processes were completed around age 18. And the age of onset is between 18 and 25, but it differs between males and females. Two important differences here. The males are more likely to manifest schizophrenia at an earlier age than the females, closer to 18 than 25. And they're also more likely to manifest the more severe form of schizophrenia. The term for the more severe form of schizophrenia varies from time to time, but the term that we use currently is deficit schizophrenia. That is an abnormality in the actual structure of the brain rather than a biochemical abnormality. It's definitely concentrated in a lower social class, but we have a controversy about which came first, class or schizophrenia. There are plenty of people who are born into wealthier classes and become schizophrenic, are no longer able to function at higher occupational levels and spiral, that is drift, down the social class ladder and end up at the bottom of the pile. That happens. It happened to my cousin Jimmy. Actually, I want to take that back. He was born into a wealthy family, but he would have ended up homeless had he not suicided. The other explanation for the concentration of schizophrenia among the impoverished is that it's because of the great number of people who are born into lower class settings, and because of the stressors associated with lower class life, we'll mention a couple today, such as viruses, it ups the ante for the psychosis later in the late teens. If I had to make a guess, and I emphasize the word guess, speculation, educated speculation, I suppose, there's more evidence for the stress hypothesis than there is for the drift hypothesis. I'm not standing here saying that there aren't people who are born into wealthy groups and who drift down. They happen. I'm just saying that there seem to be more cases of people who are born into the lower class than those who drift into it. So both are true, but I think that the numbers are varied. That's why I have a little asterisk next to stress. Interestingly enough, in Europe in the 1920s, they discovered that these people were especially likely to be born during the winter. That's one of the things that sort of initiated, jump-started our research back in, I think it was 1989, 1990. I'm just going to leave that hanging for now because I want to dissect it later when we get to some later slides. Suicide rate, it's huge. 1,000 times greater than America at large. But I really do question the number because to me, suicide is an act carried out by a person who not only killed themselves, but also intended to do so. I think intention is really a strong component of the meaning of suicide. And many of these people do dangerous things that make them end up dead. Nice grammar, Bernie. It's not because they wanted to die, it's because they may have got involved in a dangerous set of circumstances, heard the voice of God that told them that they could fly, and they go off a tall building. And that gets counted as a suicide. I mentioned my cousin Jimmy before. He was very deranged. He made it through college somehow, University of Miami. But when he got home and returned to my aunt and uncle, it was a hellish nightmare. He refused treatment. Involuntary commitment became a real possibility. That was the only option that we had left. Long and short of it is that he was forced on a medication, but it cleared up his thinking in a way that seemed to be more rational than before, but by no means was anywhere near the clear thinking of my friend Vince. And so his medication did him in. One of the side effects of his drugs was regular nosebleeds. And as a consequence, he would have to go to an ear, nose, and throat specialist every week or two. We have to bring him there. And they would cauterize the tiny capillaries in his nose with an electric cauterizing needle. Well, anyway, while in there, these fools who worked in this office let a psychotic alone in an examining room, and he opened up an unlocked medicine chest, stole a vial of liquid cocaine, because Jimmy had done every drug in the world except the liquid form of cocaine, and he thought he could get real high if he ingested it. So he went home and swallowed the whole vial, and my aunt heard this big thump upstairs, dead, 23, 24, cardiac arrest, overdose of cocaine, listed as a suicide. And I don't know about you guys, but how many people in here really think that that's a suicide? I don't. So the rate of suicide is great, it's huge, but my point is that a lot of it is inflated by their own acts that were not intended to kill them. I don't know how to go about talking about the symptoms of schizophrenia in a way that's organized and complete and still do what we're planning on doing here in the next hour or so. When I teach this course, when we talk about this research, I make it clear that there's about half a dozen ways of slicing and dicing the different symptoms of schizophrenia. And I want to concentrate on the difference between deficit and non-deficit schizophrenia. But before I do, let me just mention one really overwhelming central symptom of schizophrenia. These are the A's of schizophrenia. They're called the A's because in med school they're used as a very convenient way for people to remember the central symptoms of schizophrenia when they go through the psychiatric rotation. Long and short of it is that the central, the most overwhelming, the most blatant manifest symptom of schizophrenia is the first one, looseness of association. To say that they don't think clearly is really an understatement. There was a time, not that many years ago, when part of my course was a field trip to Norristown State Hospital. That's when they had a lot of patients. Patient population at one time was 6,000, now it's under 300. So it's a huge mass release out into the streets. At any rate, it was around 2002, 2003 when I was able to make my last field trip, and I took the Nova students with me, and it looked like a typical day. My friend Laura Brovin, my sidekick at Norristown, brought in one of her patients. There were 30 students in a daycare setting, day room setting, not daycare. And she introduces the patient. His name was John, and one of my students asked John, "What's it like being a patient here, John? Is it a bad experience? Is it an okay experience? What do you think of it?" And his answer was, if I can remember correctly, because it was really off the wall, "I'm really glad you asked me that question, because I think that you're one of the most charming women I've ever met, but you're ugly as hell. And the reason why I like it here is because I despise it. And the reason I despise it is because there's too much sex going on. And the reason for that is because of the plumbing system. Why is it that we have to tolerate every midnight a mass flushing of the toilets at the same time that the clock tower bell strikes midnight? And that's the same time," he's getting agitated now, "and that's the same time, often at Halloween, when they set off that spaceship down in Florida. We shouldn't have to put up with that shit." This is a quote. "And always, it seems to coincide with the resurfacing of the driveway. Why do we have to put up with these smells and all this sex and this water and the spaceships? It just doesn't make sense." Well, they got an earful of what was stated in class as looseness of association. Words are one thing, a clinical experience is something else. And if anybody in here followed what I just said, well, you got a problem. All right, I just wanted to mention that one symptom on that one slide. Let's get to where it's at in terms of our research here at Villanova. We started this project in 1989. We were fortunate, Barney without his glasses. We were fortunate to gain access to 2,000 medical records from Norristown State, and they're really richly detailed, thick records that occupy the whole top wall in my office. And for 10 years, I found it to be a rather frustrating experience because we really didn't have what we call a hit. We didn't have anything in the way of a previously unknown cause. We had found that the Winterbourne phenomenon was true for a certain segment of the 2,000 patients at Norristown. For some reason, it was true for the black patients and not the white patients. So we thought something was going on that involved impoverishment, but we really weren't sure. They are interesting days because when you put together your birthday and race and being psychotic, it gets a lot of media attention. And Brian and I went to a number of radio stations for interviews, and I could keep you here for a couple hours with some of the funny stories of what happened there. But I'm not in here for humor, I'm in here for seriousness. Around 1990, along comes a new member of our team. All right, so it's Gallagher, the psychiatric sociologist. I know that sounds strange. Jones, the sociologist statistician, and McFalls, the sociologist demographer. We needed a clinical psychologist, and we found a really good one. His name was Tony Pisa. I knew him through an attorney friend of mine, and he had spent 13 years working in ours downstate, so he knew these records inside out. He was a great help, because when we started to divide schizophrenia into subtypes, namely deficit and non-deficit, all types of things jumped off of Brian's laptop. Let me give you a little synopsis of the differences between these two. Originally known as type 1, non-deficit schizophrenia is manifested clinically through what are known as positive symptoms. Now, by the word positive, I don't mean anything good. I mean things that are added to the normal personality that shouldn't be there, such as auditory or visual hallucinations, such as delusions, the belief that other people are out to get you, or delusions of grandeur. I've met many a patient in our downstate with delusions of grandeur. I've met John F. Kennedy 4 times. Robespierre, Jesus Christ, is in many award, or was in many award. Mick Jagger, twice. The same patients were hospitalized simultaneously in the same ward. Big mistake. All kinds of strutting and competition. You know, life in a mental hospital is stressful enough without that going on. Theoretically, and I think there's some solid evidence for this, this appears to be a biochemical form of schizophrenia because it's responsive to meds. And as a consequence, you know what, I don't think this is the right word here. I use the word better prognosis. Prognosis really means chances for recovery. And I don't mean to imply that the medication cures the schizophrenia, but it does control the symptoms. It's better than my cousin, for instance, before he was on the medication. Originally known as type 2, deficit, I don't want to sugarcoat things in here. It's a much worse form of schizophrenia. My colleagues at Norristown referred to it as a death sentence. And I said, what the hell do you mean by that? And they said, well, Bernie, if you spent enough time here, when you work with these people, and you had to choose between cancer and schizophrenia, which is a really macabre choice, it's not just my friend Laura, but many members of her staff say that they would take the cancer, because at least there's an end in sight. It's manifested by negative symptoms, that is, things which should be present in a normal human personality are missing. The most central of which is the desire to interact with other people. The most manifest of which is refusal to speak, mutism. This has been connected with an abnormality in the actual structure of the brain. That's why it's typically not responsive to medications. And I think here I'm understating by using the terms poor prognosis. Chances for recovery, presently, there's hope in the future, but chances for recovery from that form of schizophrenia are not very good. Okay, with that as background, let me proceed to my cheat sheet here, because I want to pick out certain slides for today's presentation. 6 or 7, I have a question mark next to them. Of course, I can't read these things. I don't want to put on my glasses because I'm vain, and I want you all to realize just how ugly I am without them. Number, not that. Once again, as an introduction to where I'm headed today, there's so many different known causes of schizophrenia. Those in the medical column are genetic, biochemical, and what we're working on, natality theory. The older theories, being older doesn't necessarily make them invalid, connect with life stressors. Right now, the best guess is that most cases of schizophrenia are the result of a biological predisposition known as diathesis combined with a stressor. Okay, I can read the numbers. I'm adjusting to the darkness. Number 10. Gotcha. What I mentioned before of an abnormality in brain structure with deficit schizophrenia. Here's a picture. It's not a very good picture. It's an old black and white ditty about what type of abnormalities we're looking at. One of the most common reported abnormalities in the structure of the brain with people with deficit schizophrenia is enlarged ventricles, which are present in this patient and even more so in that patient. I'm not an expert in neurology, but I know a few buzzwords. I know that the ventricles are places where neurotransmitters and such fluids are stored, and that in schizophrenic patients, these ventricles enlarge and occupy tissue area that should have been occupied by normal brain substance. A better shot of what appears to be deficit schizophrenia, and also is more interesting because here are two people who are genetically identical, but discordant for schizophrenia. One is normal, and the other one is psychotic. And look at the difference. You can see it. That's why I have a hard time accepting those older theories that your mother did it to you. Well, it must have been one hell of a mother to end up causing this type of hole in the brain. So these are two 44-year-old guys. This one was normal. This one was schizophrenic. You can see the enlarged ventricles. Question is, how could two people who are genetically identical be so different? I can give you a guess. It may have to do with the timing of when the egg split. After 14 days, it's more likely to be in two sacs. I hope I have that correctly. Dichorionic. And if, in fact, the mother had a virus, it could have crossed the placenta wall to one sac and not the other. That's just my best guess in 2012 as to why these two people were so different. All right, I think I'm ready to get into the Villanova stuff. I'm sorry, but you're going to see me looking serious here. These glasses, by the way, were $22.50, so I hope that you appreciate the expense that I went today. That and the rented suit, and we're really happy. Slide 14. Here we are. This is what started this little exploration with Brian and Joe and Tony back around 1990. We were curious to first examine to see whether there was any kind of birth seasonality effect in our data set. And as I said before, the Winterborn phenomenon was first reported back in the early 20th century in Europe. And the explanation for this was really controversial. I'll get to that in a second. But at any rate, it wasn't just in Europe. It was in a lot of other countries throughout the world, including countries with reverse seasons, where they're winter during our summer. But the thing that really triggered the idea that it might have been influenza was what happened in the Helsinki area in 1957. There was a major pandemic of influenza. And lo and behold, some 20 to 22 years later, admissions rates for schizophrenia in that area of Europe increased by 88%. That got my attention. That's a big bump. Why did people theorize about this Winterborn phenomenon? What was the underlying cause? Well, the first one I thought was just outrageously silly. It's based on the idea that schizophrenics are more likely to be sexually active during the spring, and then 9 months later, out pop the pre-schizophrenic babies. I said, whoa, what kind of thinking is that? Ran it by my friends at Norristown, who deal with these people on an everyday basis, and they said, don't dismiss it. It's not a joke. Although medications do diminish libido, it still exists, and the rate of sexual activity increases as the weather improves. During the spring, they go outside. So I no longer laugh at that. It may account for some cases, but I certainly don't think it accounts for anything near a majority. We think, and a lot of other people think that this is where it's at. Winter damage, because of the excessive number of a number of viruses, not just influenza, but there are about 100 other winter-related viruses. So I told you about the people on the team, Brian, me, Joe, and Tony. I'm not going to tell you about the funny media stories because that's another topic. I want to get into What happened in the 2000s when we started to divide things by subtype? So now we're modern. And now we realize that it's more than just being born during the winter. When we took a closer look at the patients in our sample, we saw that they're more likely to have been in utero during the winter rather than born during the winter. So we changed the whole approach and the terminology from winter birth phenomenon to winter pregnancy phenomenon. We're sociologists. We didn't know jack about fetal brain development. But his character was smart enough to take us to a group of people who did. People at the Wistar Institute at Penn. Remember that shit all those decades ago? Mm-hmm. And we got a good lecture about how fetal brain development occurs and how different trimesters connect with certain aspects of the development of the fetal brain. And to summarize, we were told by the experts that during the first trimester, if everything goes as planned, then the number of brain cells will be established. During the second trimester, the migration of those cells to the appropriate places occurs, if everything goes as planned. And then during the last trimester, biochemical connections are completed. That's if everything goes as planned, okay look. So we took a look at the birth patterns, the birth dates by month of the patients in our sample. That would be the entire sample because we had the birth dates for all of them, so it was a huge number of people. And we wanted to see how they compared with the normal population. And this is where Joe McFalls was especially helpful, because as a demographer, he was able to give us what we call a population model. There, the blue bars are the people in America born on average from January through December. So you can find your birthday and see whether you fall into a popular birth month or one that's not so. But look at what happened here. A real big birth spike for non-deficit schizophrenia in January, consistent with the original winter birth phenomenon. By the way, this logo up here isn't bragging. We're not that outrageous. Touch on it. It's actually a warning that these are the first findings of their kind, and they shouldn't be taken as fact because these findings need to be replicated by other researchers. But anyway, keep in mind the birth spike in January along those with the milder, if I may use that word, form of schizophrenia, that is non-deficit. Not so for those with the worst form. Here, the birth spike was in September, count back 9 months, and they were conceived in January. I never, to this day, have been able to explain what was going on in November. Just a curious anomaly. The slide that really summarizes this best is the next one, and that is this huge birth spike in January among those with non-deficit schizophrenia, and in September among those with deficit schizophrenia. Once again, here are the words. Non-deficits are more likely to be in utero during influenza month during the third trimester, and the deficits are more likely to have been conceived during that time. We're not talking about tiny little numbers either. The excessive number of births among the psychotics compared to the normal population is almost 30% here and 35% over there. All right? By the way, the way that these things work is anytime a person has a question, hands up, right? Okay, so feel comfortable.
So what is your N again?
2000, right? Fine.
The whole data set is 2,000.
Yeah, we were able to use the whole data set for this because we had the birth dates. Now later, when I start to tell you things about subtype and the effect of social class, the sample size gets smaller because we only had really clear-cut information for, I'd say, around 800 that would allow us to really be absolutely certain that these are pure deficits and these are pure non-deficits. We didn't want to deal with those that seemed to have mixed symptomatology or whose diagnosis was unclear. So also when we add in social class, because in the social histories of those records, it's information allowing us to basically assess who was born into a poor family and who was born into a non-poor family. But in other cases, it's not clear. So we also would lose more cases that way. So attrition becomes a problem as we move into these future slides. But for that, it was the whole deal.
I'm sorry I walked in late, but what is your sample? Is it global or is it?
No, it's from a state mental hospital in Norristown.
So one location?
Yeah, not far from here. about 2,000 patients. Okay. And 11. In class, I go through the whole thing. Hey, Brian, I told you I should have picked out certain slides. And he said, oh, no, you better bring them in case somebody has something. Well, maybe they will. 10 and 11 did that. 14 and 15 did that. We're back here. So what are we to draw in the way of conclusions from those birth month patterns? An inference that deficit schizophrenia may be associated with a virus during the first trimester. We're looking especially at influenza because January is flu month, traditionally over centuries. And an inference that those with non-deficit schizophrenia were likely to have been exposed to the same problem, namely influenza, but during the third trimester, biochemical processes either completed them and something goes wrong, and this was a prenatal hit, a virus, then we may end up with something that responds to medication. I really kind of wish that I hadn't put the word hopeless up here. In class, I feel comfortable using it, but I know that some people have come here today because they have friends and relatives who are affected by this condition, and I really don't want you to think that the whole deal is down the tubes. These are an interesting group. They're not going to be discussed today, but I've been reading about the Genane quads for, I think, since I was in grade school. This is a group of identical baby girls. They were born in 1930 in a Midwestern town, and the National Institute of Mental Health studied them. Identical baby quads, all girls, all schizophrenics. The chances of that occurring are estimated by NIMH to be 1 in a billion. So they really became a real jackpot for NIMH who followed them throughout their lives. Interestingly enough, by the way, the Genane last name is fake. That comes from the Greek origin of dreadful birth, dreadful gene, also known as dire birth. I've seen two interpretations of it. They're not their real names. Nora, Iris, Myra, and Hester. That stands for NIMH. I don't think a lot of us would probably call our kids Hester anyway. If I'm stepping on anybody's grandmother's name, I apologize. But in an attempt to preserve the anonymity of the Genane family, they gave them those names. But curiously enough, here are 4 genetically identical people, all who were schizophrenic, but the firstborn and the lastborn had severe cases of schizophrenia. They didn't use the terminology deficit and non-deficit back in 1930. They just talked about mild, moderate, severe, and profound. Well, Nora and Hester, profound, and Iris and Myra, not so. So what happened there? The best thinking I've seen is that something happened at delivery, where the firstborn may have suffered a brain injury by being the first one to force her way down a birth canal. That's all theoretical. And the lastborn, because of the length of the delivery, may have suffered hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, and may also have resulted in a brain abnormality. Anyway, I just thought I'd tell you about the Genanes because they're interesting. But I want to get back to what we're all about here. I said to Brian, what if we try to put all these things together? The risk for deficit schizophrenia, time of conception, and social class. You got it. That purple ball is elevated, not just for visual reasons, but because when I have the confirmation sitting here, it's extremely statistically significant. As you see here, the y-axis is an increased risk for the worst form, and over here we have the ones who were in utero during influenza season during the last trimester, right? Those born in January, am I being clear so far? Am I doing all right? Okay. And then over here, those born in September are the ones who were conceived during January, and this huge, huge increase, elevated risk for deficit schizophrenia among those who were conceived in January to poor mothers. It didn't seem to matter for the other ones, and we think that that has to do with the fact that women who are impoverished receive little in the way of prenatal health care. That was enough for me to be pretty convinced, couldn't prove it, pretty convinced that a prenatal illness, in this case influenza during the first trimester, can result in the worst form of schizophrenia, namely deficit. Well, we had a problem. We couldn't prove that these mothers had flu because we didn't have that kind of detailed information. But it sure looked that way. We got lucky. By sheer luck, random chance, coincidence, a separate research team at the medical school at Columbia University was conducting similar research, but based on hands-on blood serum that would allow them to really ascertain which mothers had influenza and how their children ended up psychiatrically some 20, 25 years later. Take a look at this. Both of these things happened around 2004, 2005. We had the evidence about type of schizophrenia, social class, and seasonality of birth. But we didn't have the evidence that it really was a flu. These people did. Headed by Alan Brown at Columbia, these people were champing at the bit to uncork blood serum vials that had been archived from an old HMO in Northern California. I'm sure many of them passed before the vials were open because you had to wait 20, 25 years. And so they tracked the children born to those mothers, and they found, no doubt about it, that women who they knew had influenza during the first trimester were likely to have children who became schizophrenics as adults. They didn't know anything about social class, they didn't know anything about type of schizophrenia, just schizophrenia in general. So that gave us the nail in the coffin. Because if you put together the evidence we have here from Nova about deficit, first trimester, social class, combined with the proof that influenza ups the ante for schizophrenia, I think it's a pretty compelling case. They estimate that the increased rate for schizophrenia among women who have influenza during the first trimester is 700%. That's huge. Now, when I saw that number, I said things to myself, things that I couldn't put in a PowerPoint, you know, the way I really talk. Can't do that in the classroom. So I cleaned up my intrapsychic act and said, geez, that's huge. And then, the other thing that really got me from the research was that they estimated statistically that had these women not been exposed to influenza, that we would have 14% fewer cases today. So I just did a geez again kind of thing. So do the math here. 14% of the 3,360,000 people who are schizophrenic in general is somewhere around 460,000. It's an estimate. Hey, if it was 300,000, it's still big. It's a lot of lives saved. That's where a lot of academicians would stop. You know, write it up as a journal article, send it off to some fancy journal and get credit for it. But there's more to it than that. Is there something that can be done about the fact that some cases of serious schizophrenia seem to be the result of influenza? Here's one little, here we go. So if you put together the Villanova stuff with the Columbia findings, I call it the big bingo. I know I'm corny, but just my natural way of things. If you add the two together, I feel very comfortable using the word irrefutable conclusion that influenza during the first trimester, blah, 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 especially true for the poor. But what I wanted to throw out today that I thought you might find interesting, and I'm really looking for audience feedback here because I'm not really sure about some of these things. What do you do about it? Well, logic would dictate that you vaccinate women who are pregnant or who plan on becoming pregnant. That's what logic would dictate. But here, logic would lose big time because the policy of the American Medical Association forever has been never vaccinate a pregnant woman or anyone who plans on becoming pregnant. during influenza season. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not standing here trying to slam the AMA. They were simply doing what they thought was in the best interest of the mother and the baby. But it proved to have dire consequences. And so, those of you who receive flu shots might have noticed in that little pamphlet that you get when you go in October, of the list of people who are at risk, the elderly and those with certain types of health problems. Now, the policy has done a 180. The policy now is, and I want to thank our colleagues at Columbia for getting this information into the AMA to change it. The policy now is vaccinate all women during all trimesters, as well as those who expect to be pregnant during influenza season. Will it have an effect? I'll tell you in another 15 or 20 years, when we should see a dip if all this is in fact true. But there's a problem here. I've been emphasizing all along that there's a sociology to this issue, namely being born into a lower social class environment. So if you change the AMA policy on influenza vaccination, what effect is that going to have on the poor? They don't get health care anyway. Most of them don't have a physician. Most of them go through the 9 months of gestation without ever having seen someone with an MD after their name. So you can change all you want about the AMA policy, but the problem is, how do you get the vaccine to the impoverished? So I threw this out to my class last week, and one woman had a creative idea. He said, well, if they're on welfare, make sure that in October they have to come in and pick up their check, because we can give them a shot then. I said, well, that's your thinking, at least I have your attention. Problem is that a lot of people are poor who are not on welfare. There's this group known as the working poor. I thought that one way to do this, and of course we need government cooperation, funding, etc., is to have a massive television campaign that makes this clear to America, and poor people and rich people all watch TV, that influenza during pregnancy can really be hazardous to the baby's mental health. Make that widely known. And then make flu shots available for free at the local Rite Aid. Maybe that's not enough. Because on Thursday I got another question in class, and that is, well, why don't you do something about it? He's talking to me, the student. He didn't talk like that. He said, Dr. Gallagher first, why don't you do something about it? And I said, geez, I never thought about it. We as academics often think that if we uncover findings and we report them, and that's it, and then somebody's going to take a hold of them and actually implement them as social policy. And I guess perhaps we should take an additional step. I don't know how to go about doing it. I did use you as a scapegoat. I said, I'm going to tell Brian about this because he can really convince people to do just about anything. But I have no idea what agency we'd even go to. NIMH, federal administration, depends on who's in office. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the nexus of what I wanted to say today. This thing that is saying an update ready to install is one of the many things that bother me about computers, and I've learned that sophisticated trick of deleting it. Anybody, I have a few other things that I want to say about differences between males and females that you might find interesting, but does anybody have any other ideas about what to do about this impoverished problem? Yeah.
Well, I just have a question on the ones that did not develop schizophrenia, that had the flu during those time periods, and they did not develop, the offspring did not develop schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Was there any difference in the treatment, i.e., were the individuals who were developing the schizophrenic-prone offspring taking one sort of medication for their flu versus the group that were not getting it, that were taking a different form of medication, i.e. it wasn't the flu virus itself, but it was the way that the flu itself was being treated.
Right.
Was anything...
Well, a couple of things pop in mind. One of the problems about the fact that when this occurs among the poor, your question about medications, etc., one of the things that happens to poor women who become ill with influenza is that they go to their local drugstore, take an over-the-counter medication, and a separate study shows that acts as an added insult itself to the fetal brain. So that makes it even worse. I think your question was also more about medications used for treatment when the person actually becomes schizophrenic.
Was it corrected for?
I don't know. I'm not really qualified to answer that question because I wasn't part of that research team. But I was going to say to everybody in here who asked me a question where I say I don't know, and here's one. Oh, I got to have a few more. I'm not going to make stuff up. But I know how to find out the answer to that. So if you give me your name and email address, I'll gladly check out what they did at Columbia in terms of whether they held constant type of treatment and type of medication. I'd be happy to do that. It'd be good for you. It'd be good for me to learn a few things. Yeah.
I still had a question on that AMA.
No more questions. No. Are you a student?
Yes, I am.
Oh no, you have to pay tuition. See how funny I am? You don't think so?
Well, when you get a vaccination, I mean, the big worry is that you have the active
Right.
virus in you briefly. So wouldn't it make more sense to actually vaccinate before becoming pregnant for that, for the season? And then, I mean, that seems like...
Yeah, they vaccinated in October.
You're playing with a little fire there, but I guess you would be added...
They vaccinated in October for January influenza. I'm really glad you raised that question because a lot of people think that if you give people in general, not just pregnant women, but people in general, an influenza shot, that you're up in the ante for giving them the flu. But that's not true. That's a widely spread misconception across the United States. It's a dead virus. And to answer your question in a better way, a separate study was conducted with 300 women who were pregnant and vaccinated for influenza. And then they waited 22 years later to see what happened to the offspring. The rate of schizophrenia among the offspring is 1%. Just what we would expect it to be, right?
Yeah.
So it didn't have any deleterious, is that how you say that word? Effects. Question? You were just stretching?
Just flexing.
You asked a question, man. I'm screwed. You're supposed to have all the answers. Yeah.
You don't really know of any other illness in pregnancy, like not necessarily the flu, but
Right.
what would cause a fever or...
Yeah, flu
But that would be what affected the development
Flu
of the
seems to be the
brain.
big one, but I've also read reports that one report stated that there are 100 other viruses that are more common during the winter, and I would like to know what those other viruses are and whether they can, in fact, also act as an insult to fetal
Like
brain.
fever and all that.
Yeah, I can find out if you'll do the same thing that I asked her to do.
Okay.
I'd like to see what kind of hit I get with winter-related viruses in general
Or just
and
illnesses,
schizophrenia.
just illness.
Well,
being
wait,
ill,
okay.
Any illness.
In our data set, we do have other variables. One is whether the mother was ill during pregnancy, but the way it's worded is simply ill. It doesn't specify the actual type of illness. And when we looked at the connection there, we called it an obstetrical complication. We threw all these together. When we looked at the connection there and elevated risk for schizophrenia, we found that there was a connection. But we also found that other things during pregnancy also can have this negative impact. We also found that when the woman was on drugs during pregnancy, was drinking, was married to or with one of those snaggletooth creatures that beat them up, nothing can be more of a blow to a fetal brain than that type of hit, as well as obstetrical complications, things that might have gone wrong during delivery. When we added them all up, we found a connection with deficit schizophrenia. But when we looked at them separately, maybe it was sample size, I'm not sure. Brian says that it was. We found that when we added them all together, there was a connection between deficit, that no one particular one of the 9 variables in the OC set connected with deficit. But I still want to answer your question about the other viruses. So will you give me your name?
Sure.
Give me your name and phone number. Yes, sir.
Did I understand you to say that auditory hallucinations are associated with non-deficit?
That's right. Yes, non-deficit schizophrenia, positive symptoms, manifest, overt. They've been described as appearing more crazy, which is not the way I'd like to speak. But hallucinations, such as seeing things. I've met people who have seen me as a burning bush, or auditory hallucinations, hearing voices that may be insulting, or maybe grandiose, such as the voice of God. Yeah, they're associated with non-deficit, that type of, and I'm making generalizations here, rather sweeping, that type of schizophrenia is known to respond to medication. So that's
So
hope.
deficit type would normally not include these types of auditory hallucinations?
That's right. We were looking at pure deficit, those with only negative symptoms and those with only positive symptoms. And sorry, you asked a great question because a lot of the patients in our sample had mixed symptomatology. So I don't want to give this group the impression that all schizophrenics can be divided into deficit and non-deficit. There are those that are sort of a potpourri of the symptoms of both categories. Thanks for coming. Who's next? Huh? Yes.
Is the study of schizophrenia
Yeah.
amenable to animal models, or we don't recognize schizophrenia in mice to be
I used to have a crazy dog. I don't know if that helps. Did you really?
A very nice question, I'm not in the field.
Well, I'm not in the field of animal behavior either, but I think our
But I love
lady
psychology
friend here,
again.
good thing you paid your tuition. What's the answer?
Like
Good to help me out
fear
here.
extinction
I don't
and-
know about higher organisms, but I do know that there's pretty extensive research with rats where you try and do lesions on the brain or biochemical interference to induce a schizophrenic, at least a schizophrenic affect.
Uh-huh.
And the rats would get influenza, right?
Oh, I don't know about the influenza part, but I do know you can induce schizophrenia in animals.
Do rats get influenza? I mean, I never heard of it.
I don't know. That's why I'm
Yeah,
asking if
I
it
don't
is
know. I never
amenable
heard
to
of it.
animal model studies, because you can do it quickly instead of waiting another
Yeah.
generation. The kids who are born today to become 20 years old and simply get schizophrenia.
Yeah.
You can do the experiment much faster because the life cycle is much
You're a
shorter.
pretty interesting lady. That's a pretty interesting question. And also because, you know, you don't have to wait around 25 years, right, to see what
Yeah, but with the
happens.
mice, you wait just days.
Do you have references to that?
I could probably get
Can you
them.
send them to me?
Yeah.
I'll
I
pass
mean,
them over.
you're doing what they're studying is non-logical thought processes, so I don't know if it would be deficit or non-deficit
Yeah.
schizophrenia, but I can get some references for you.
Illogical thought processes in rats?
Yeah, so you know how they do like the maze thing in rats a lot, like
Yeah.
with where can they logically find from point A to point B and that sort of
Right.
thing. So you start to induce schizophrenia, one of the most obvious things is that they can't follow the logical path system. Like you teach them one way, you have your controls that can do it, and then you have your schizophrenic rats that cannot reproduce those same results because they're, like you said, they're the non-logical thought process of that
Right.
guy that was talking about the plumbing system and the sex and everything.
Cool.
So similar.
Yeah,
Are you in a master's program in psychology?
No, I'm working on one in chemistry, but I
Okay.
was a biopsychology major in college.
You want to get up here?
So.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I wonder if they have made correlation studies with the southern hemisphere when the influenza.
Oh, yeah, in an
I
earlier
mean, you
slide.
said it earlier, I was not here.
Yeah, in that slide. In southern hemisphere countries, when their winter is the opposite of our summer, there's also a winter spike phenomenon.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's been tested as well. You know what I'd like to see? I'd like to see a study done in a place like Florida that doesn't have changing seasons and see if any of this stuff really occurs there. That's what I'd like to see. I wanted to tell you something about differences that we just uncovered between males and females. If you have a few more minutes, it's only a couple slides. Are you interested enough to hear some? Okay, good. Because this is brand new stuff, not even off the press. It's just at the press stage. Find it here. No. That's your stuff, Roy. Here we go. For statistical testing reasons, over my head but not above his, we're only able to control for 3 variables at a time. So here we substituted social class with gender to see if there was any kind of seasonality pattern that connected with deficit schizophrenia. And lo and behold, it seems to be especially true for males. So what's going on there? Once again, we're dealing in a field in which none of us are really qualified to explain, but that doesn't mean we can't read. And we did a pretty good literature review and found that for a lot of reasons, the male fetus seems to be especially susceptible to something going wrong during gestation because it's described in tons of articles as being more fragile than the female fetus. I wonder what they meant by fragility, and it was expressed in a number of ways. If you look at the number of male fetuses to female fetuses that make it to live birth, male to female, it's probably like 1 to 2. So they're more likely to spontaneously abort Other types of problems involve alteration in heart rhythms during gestation, extended cord, which can complicate delivery by being wrapped around the neck. There's a whole host of things that are connected with the male fetus that make it much more vulnerable than the female fetus. So while it may be true, now that Dean's gone, I can kid around. While it may be true that he and I, as males, are a member of the superior gender, this is what I say in class to make sure that they're listening, we sure didn't start off that way, because we weren't likely to make it to the live birth to begin with. And I also wanted to show you one last slide to give you a more global picture of schizophrenia rather than just what we do here. That's our data set, that'll bore you. I want to go up here. Here it is. If there's anything that I want you to take from today's talk, it's the fact that we really don't know what causes schizophrenia. I think I started off by saying that, but we're starting to zero in on the causes. So in 2012, it seems that the best guesstimate of what is going on here is what I call the big chronological picture. And some of this is not a source of controversy. It can often start off with genes. The genetic markers are yet to be identified, although the literature is filled with reports from places like Penn and Cornell and Michigan that they've uncovered a link between schizophrenia and genetic marker number 24 or whatever it might be. They're starting. But that's for schizophrenia in general. What our research indicates is that the type of schizophrenia seems to be a result of whether something went awry during the 9 months of gestation, as well as the time right around delivery. So a prenatal insult, such as influenza or an obstetrical complication, that affects the type. And as I said before, the timing of the insult affects whether it's non-deficit or deficit, especially for poor people, particularly for the male fetuses. Then I looked at that slide and I said, it seems awfully academic. Why don't I just try to put it to the students in a way that's more clear? And so I was down the shore one night a number of years ago, and I decided to do this. And I turned to Guinness. That's a beer, if you're more than familiar. And after 2 or 3 of them, I got creative. And I made up this sentence, plain old English. A male fetus conceived in January into an impoverished family with a history of mental illness. We've had a lot of genetic loading in our sample. And further traumatized by an obstetrical complication. I don't want to put those words up there anymore. I think I want to take the word doom away because it really is very pessimistic for relatives of patients. But the result is deficit schizophrenia. And that's everything that I have to say. Are there any more questions? Yeah.
The genetics of this, if I can be personal, I have an uncle who my cousin tells me, well, I know he made it through Holy Cross, he graduated with a degree, but came back, and my cousin told me he became aware later, my cousin, that while he was at Holy Cross, he experienced auditory.
Yeah, it often occurs during college. A lot of people in the field, when they write up, I'm sorry to interrupt you, when they write up case histories of people with age of onset and they're a sophomore in college, they write it up as if college is at fault. It's not our fault. These are the best 4 years of their freaking lives.
Well, I thought it was
but it's just the
remarkable that
timing.
he completed his degree.
Yes.
I think. In any event.
I think it's remarkable my cousin did, because not only was he totally schizophrenic, but he's also dropping acid right and left down in Florida. But go ahead with your relative.
So he's my uncle with schizophrenia. I have an adult sister who's 50, who I guess has non-deficit schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm. She takes meds and they help.
Well, that's we can get into a whole discussion, but she's capable to live on her own with Medicaid and assistance from the SSI and those kinds of things. And so my question is, and there's been a history of alcoholism on both sides of my ancestral family, which would be considered mental illness. So my own children, what is the likelihood that their offspring?
Oh, okay.
I don't need specific numbers, but
I have them in another slide I didn't put up.
what should I try to inform them of with regards to, besides make sure you get an influenza shot before you get pregnant.
You know, I feel like you came here like you're my brother, and I purposely asked you to ask this question because it just so happens that I had a slide that answers your question. Here we go. Over here is degree of genetic similarity in this column, right? Identical twins are 100% the same. And over here, by risk, that means if one person is known to have schizophrenia, what is the chance of the other person having? In the case of identical twins, where one of the twins is known to be a diagnosed schizophrenic, the chances for the other one becoming schizophrenic, it's really more likely to be 50, but I used a table with 46. And then, as you can see, it is also the same here, where both parents were diagnosed schizophrenics. Fraternal twins, who are no more genetically similar than brothers and sisters, it's only 14%, but it's still higher than the 1% that we would expect, so there may be some environmental effect of twinning being raised the same. That was the one explanation for why 2 of the Janine quads were similar and the other 2 were like a different set of twins. What was your question about whether, if you have a brother or a sister?
Yes?
That.
That's your likelihood, not your children.
That's,
Well, I'm 65, so, you know.
you got nothing to worry about. You kidding me? I can tell by looking at you, you're cool.
That's true, but
You look fine to me. I think your sweater is probably the best one in here.
thank you.
So it would have been 10%, but it would have reared its head by age 18 or 25.
Would his nephew niece be the
I'm
one
talking
who's
about
looking at
skipping a
3%
generation,
for his
like-
children? He's
Yeah.
already got
Children.
kids.
You worry about the next
Are you
row?
asking about your
Yeah.
children or your
3%.
My grandchildren.
His
The next row.
I'm saying
grandchildren.
skipping a generation. My sister has schizophrenia. Had an uncle who had schizophrenia.
Oh,
My
that's
own
not there.
children, I'm asking about my grandchildren, skipping that generation. And so it would probably be statistically insignificant, I guess, from a genetic point of view.
Given those numbers. If you were to slip in a new category,
Be the lower end of the range somewhere.
it would be very low. You know what? I'm sorry I don't have the exact
That's quite all right.
right group up there, but it would definitely be diminished. One of the things that my students pointed out to me is the 2%. If your husband or wife is schizophrenic, the likelihood of you having schizophrenia is 2%. That's 100% greater than society at large. So it was funny kind of at the time. A student last year raised her hand and said, can you get this through sex? And I, you know, laugh at the student, but what the hell? I never really even paid enough attention to that 2% because that is 100% more than 1%. But then I did a little thinking and I realized that, you know, on more than one occasion, people have met in state mental hospitals and they've had sex and have responded to their meds to the point where they're seen as cool enough to be discharged, and they go out and they created romances in places like Norristown State or Hereford State when it existed, and they ended up to be married. So I think that's why that occurs there. But the answer to your question is I wouldn't worry too much.
My larger question is, do you have any analysis of births that took place without any of those?
Yes, we compared people who had any OCs to those who didn't.
And was there any difference in the incidence of schizophrenia?
Yes.
Of deficit.
Deficit.
They were all schizophrenic.
Right, no.
But
I
up the
meant
ante for
of
deficit. Yeah.
It was for poor people, right?
Yeah.
It was what we call in the trade an interaction effect.
Yeah.
So the effect only occurred among poor people and males.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And
So segments of the population, not the whole population.
you may wonder why an obstetrical complication would be connected to being impoverished. And I think Jim McFall has probably offered the best explanation, and that is the lack of prenatal health care. If an obstetrical complication occurs, it's likely to run its full course in an impoverished setting because no one's there to intervene, from a medical background. Wow, that's some good questions. I guess the best questions are the ones I can't answer. You're gonna, oh, here we go. The whole deal. Hey, got a beginning of a term paper. Yeah.
Any research on any improvement in treatment and help for these people? Is there any good news?
Well, I wish my friend Margot Montgomery was here. She's a psychiatrist. Our field is research. I know Jack's got about treatment, but I do know that if she were here, or somebody of her intellectual ilk, that they would say that new drugs are being created every day that seem to be more and more refined, and finding the proper medication for the right patient at the right dosage level right now can be a recipe for a much less disastrous life. Aside from that, we have changing of the AMA policy, but that's not really what you're asking about. You're asking about changes in treatment. And most of the changes in treatment have been pharmaceutical in nature, and so that would apply mainly to the non-deficit type. That's not to say that I want you people to leave here with the idea that this is all, like the term I had up there, psychiatric doom. I'm not pushing the book either. I sure as hell don't need to do that, but the painting on the front is kind of cool. It's a painting by Tiffany. I don't have it with me. Let's borrow one. Can I borrow my book?
You have to pay for
Can I
it.
pay? I'll give you $50. This painting by Tiffany, if you see it, can you see it here? It's kind of small. My brother's father-in-law is an artist, and he painted that. And you can see that all around the perimeter is really absolutely psychotic type of stuff. But in the middle, there is this oasis where everybody's real happy and in a palace and loving and caring. And the reason why I thought that that was especially appropriate for this is because you shouldn't have the impression that people who are schizophrenic are constantly psychotic. They have these periods of remission, these so-called islands of health. And I think that that's, one way why this is good for this book. I used to have a drawing by Charlie Manson, which was a stupid thing. I did it because it was sexy, but it gave people a misimpression that, she must be a mass murderer. So that's going. I found this hanging on my brother's wall in his house. I said, John, wow, what is that? He said it's a piece of, I'll fill in the blank, my father-in-law painted. I said, piece of, not to me it is, and I think it's gorgeous. Oh yeah? Yeah, take it. So I took it and hung on my wall, and then, we went through the trouble. I'm returning this. I like my money back. And then it got on there. But my point is that there are periods of remission, islands of health. So it's not a constant struggle to maintain some touch with reality. Well, yes, sir.
You mentioned get an influenza shot, okay? I think that was one of the recommendations. People should get influenza shots at the time of pregnancy, or I guess everybody should.
I think everybody should every fall. I mean, young people seem to think that they're not vulnerable to the flu.
Now,
I've been getting one since I was 2.
Is there a more particular definition of a type of flu, or just flu in general, or is there any more particularity as to the type of virus?
Not that I know of, no. Now, all the studies that I've shown talk about influenza in general and not of a particular strain. Now, I know that the Helsinki pandemic was identified as a particular strain of influenza, the one that raised hell in Europe back in 1920. But researchers at Columbia, et cetera, combine all cases of influenza, not by subtype. They're nowhere near getting to that type of refined level of knowledge. Great question, but maybe in 20 years if I'm still here, I can answer it. I'm really grateful that you came today. I didn't just want to make this academic, I also wanted to make it informative and also show you that there is some hope for what many people perceive to be a hopeless, helpless situation. I'm really grateful to Gina, and I'm really grateful to Alexandra, and I'm grateful to the members of my research team and to this university, and wow, whoever designed this second floor, I'm really grateful to them.